A map is said to exist that should not exist, not in the century it belongs to, not with the symbols it carries, and certainly not with the implication buried inside it, that someone in medieval Europe may have known of lands beyond the Atlantic before Columbus ever crossed the ocean. The name attached to the mystery is even stranger: the Knights Templar, a military order destroyed, disgraced, and dissolved centuries ago. So why would a map suggesting forbidden Western knowledge be linked to them at all? And what would it mean if even part of the story were true? For now, we have to move carefully. The map's origin remains uncertain. Its authenticity is disputed. And in a mystery like this, the most dangerous thing is not doubt. It is wanting the legend to be true before the evidence has earned it. Still, the claim refuses to disappear. Somewhere between medieval navigation, lost documents, coded symbols, and the long shadow of the Templars, a question begins to form. Not a simple question of treasure or conspiracy or secret brotherhoods. Something colder than that. A question about memory itself, and about how much of the past can vanish when the people who held it are erased. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Tonight, we begin with the object at the center of the story. A map that appears to point in the wrong direction, from the wrong time, under the wrong name. If it is ancient, it could disturb the accepted timeline of European Atlantic knowledge. If it is not, it still reveals something unsettling about us. Our hunger for hidden roots, lost orders, and proof that the official story has left something behind. Either way, the map asks to be examined, not worshipped, not dismissed, examined. The first thing to understand is that a map is never just a drawing. It is a claim. Even the simplest map says, in its quiet way, someone believed the world looked like this. Someone chose what mattered. Someone left something out. A coastline becomes a line of confidence. A symbol becomes an instruction. A blank space becomes an admission. And when a map is said to be connected to the Knights Templar, every mark on it begins to carry more weight than it probably should. The claims surrounding this particular map tend to gather around its strange details, markings that some interpret as coded signs, routes that seem to push westward across the Atlantic, locations that do not sit comfortably inside the expected medieval imagination, and symbols that, at least to a believer's eye, feel Templar in character. Crosses, geometric forms, lines that look deliberate rather than decorative, hints of direction, perhaps even intention. But this is where the investigation has to slow down. A symbol can look ancient without being ancient. A route can appear meaningful because the viewer already wants it to lead somewhere. And a mark that resembles a Templar cross may only prove that crosses were common in Christian Europe, which is not exactly the sort of revelation that makes historians drop their tea. The difficulty is that maps invite interpretation more than almost any other object from the past. You can stand before a sword and ask who carried it. You can examine a coin and ask who minted it. But a map asks something more seductive. Where was this supposed to take someone? That question is the doorway. Supporters of the Templar map theory often begin there, with the idea of a hidden route. Not necessarily a fully drawn modern coastline, not a neat medieval version of a school atlas, but a cluster of clues, enough, they argue, to suggest that someone had knowledge of Atlantic crossings or Western lands before such knowledge was supposed to circulate openly in Europe. The problem is that enough is a dangerous word. Enough for curiosity is not enough for history. To change the timeline of European Atlantic knowledge, a map would need to do more than look mysterious. It would need a stable origin. It would need to be dated. It would need to survive comparison with known cartographic traditions. It would need to show that its strange features are not later additions, artistic guesses, copying errors, or modern inventions wrapped in medieval language. At the moment, the story remains suspended in that uncomfortable space between claim and proof. And that is what makes it interesting. Because legends often grow strongest not where the evidence is abundant, but where it is incomplete in just the right way. A missing record, a broken chain of ownership, a symbol that resembles something familiar, a line pointing toward an ocean large enough to hold almost any dream placed upon it. The map, if we treat it cautiously, becomes less like a solved mystery and more like a test. It tests how much weight we are willing to place on resemblance. It tests how easily a symbol becomes a confession. And it tests whether the Templars themselves have become so powerful in the modern imagination that almost any unexplained object can be pulled into their orbit. That does not mean the map should be dismissed outright. Dismissal can be as lazy as belief. The better approach is colder and more patient. Ask what is actually present on the object. Ask what can be independently verified. And ask where interpretation begins to outrun the material. Because somewhere beneath the dramatic claim, beneath the Western roots, the coded signs, the possible clues, there is a simpler and more unsettling issue. Before we ask what the map shows, we have to ask whether we truly know where it came from. That is why the map matters. Not because it gives us a finished answer. It does not. Not because it proves the Templars crossed the Atlantic. It does not do that either. Its importance lies in the pressure it places on the story we think we know. For many people, the familiar timeline is clean enough to fit into a few lines. Medieval Europe looks east, toward the Holy Land, trade routes, pilgrimage roads, and the old worlds of scripture and empire. Then, in 1492, Columbus sails west, and Europe's documented relationship with the Americas begins to change violently, permanently, and on a scale that reshapes the planet. That version is not entirely wrong, but it is too smooth. The Atlantic was not a wall of pure ignorance before Columbus, nor was he the first human being, or even necessarily the first European, to reach the Americas. History is rarely that tidy. The real question is not whether the ocean was ever crossed before 1492. The harder question is whether any knowledge from such crossings circulated, survived, and influenced later navigation in a way we can actually prove. This is where the alleged Templar map becomes dangerous. If a map linked to the medieval order truly showed Western lands before Columbus, then it would not simply add a curious footnote to history. It would force a more uncomfortable conversation about who possessed geographic knowledge, how it was guarded, and why it did not enter the historical record in a clearer form. That is the part people often misunderstand. A pre-Columbian map of Western lands would not just be a picture. It would be evidence of a chain. Someone would have had to learn about those lands. Someone would have had to record them. Someone would have had to preserve the record. And someone, somewhere, would have had to keep that knowledge from disappearing completely. Each step in that chain is a problem. A single strange line on a map cannot carry all of that weight by itself. A symbol cannot become a ship's log. A coastline cannot become a witness. Yet the reason the legend survives is that the Templars seem, at least on the surface, like the kind of organization around which such a chain might be imagined. They had wealth. They had movement. They had connections across borders. They operated in a world of ports, fortresses, finance, letters, and long-distance travel. Their story ended abruptly enough to leave space for suspicion. And after their destruction, that space became fertile ground for almost every kind of hidden history theory. This does not prove a secret Atlantic tradition, but it explains why the idea feels plausible to some. The Templars occupy a strange place in the modern mind. They are both historical and almost mythological, real enough to leave records, charters, ruins, and accusations, mysterious enough that later generations keep returning to them with questions that the surviving evidence cannot always answer. Once an order like that is destroyed, the missing pieces begin to feel almost louder than the pieces that remain. And a map is the perfect object to place inside that silence. A map suggests intention. It suggests direction. It suggests that someone knew a way through the unknown. When tied to a fallen order, it begins to feel less like geography and more like a message that escaped a purge. That is the emotional power of the claim. But emotional power is not historical proof. The map is dangerous precisely because it stands at the border between those two forces. On one side, the disciplined demand for evidence, dating, provenance, material testing, comparison, documentation. On the other, the deep human instinct to believe that history has locked away a second version of itself, waiting for the right object to open it. And perhaps that instinct is not foolish. Many real discoveries began as uncomfortable anomalies. Archives have produced surprises. Shipwrecks have altered timelines. Old assumptions have fallen before small pieces of physical evidence. But there is a difference between an anomaly and a revelation. An anomaly asks for study. A revelation has to survive it. So the alleged Templar map remains troubling, not because it has already rewritten history, but because it touches the exact place where history is most vulnerable. The gap between what happened and what can still be proven. If the map is authentic, it points toward a lost corridor of knowledge. If it is misread, altered, or forged, it points toward something else entirely. Our willingness to give a mysterious object more authority than it has earned. Either possibility matters, because the map does not only ask what medieval Europeans may have known about the Atlantic. It asks how easily we confuse a surviving artifact with a surviving truth. The first serious problem is not hidden in a symbol. It is not concealed in a line across the ocean. It is much simpler and much more damaging. Where did the map come from? That question sounds almost disappointingly practical. It has none of the drama of secret voyages or coded Templar routes. No hooded knights moving through torchlit harbors. No sealed chest carried onto a waiting ship at midnight. Just a plain historical demand. Show us the chain. Who found it? Where was it found? When did it first appear? Who owned it before that? Was it recorded in an archive, a private collection, a monastery inventory, an estate catalog, a legal document, a scholar's notes, anywhere at all, before the modern era? These are not small objections. They are the foundation beneath every larger claim. Without provenance, an artifact becomes strangely weightless. It may still be interesting. It may still be beautiful, strange, even persuasive at first glance. But it cannot safely bear the burden of rewriting history. A map with a secure chain of custody is not just an object. It is an object with a memory attached to it. Each documented owner, each catalog entry, each old reference fixes it more firmly in time. The map becomes harder to move around, harder to reinvent, harder to slip quietly from legend into evidence. But when that chain is broken, the opposite happens. The map becomes mobile in a dangerous way. It can be placed wherever the theory needs it to be placed. It can be made older in the telling. It can be linked to famous names by suggestion rather than proof. A gap in the record becomes a stage, and onto that stage, people can walk almost any story they want. This is why provenance is often the least glamorous and most important part of historical investigation. It is also why so many legends dislike it. A dramatic artifact can survive a skeptical glance at its symbols. It can survive a debate over interpretation. It can even survive a few errors if the broader evidence is strong enough. But a dramatic artifact with no reliable past is in trouble from the beginning. And with a map, the problem is sharper. Maps are easy to copy, easy to alter, easy to age in appearance, at least enough to impress the untrained eye. They often borrow from older maps, mix traditions, preserve outdated ideas, and sometimes include decorative elements that later viewers mistake for secret information. A map may look medieval because it is imitating medieval conventions. It may include archaic spelling because someone wanted it to feel old. It may contain symbols that seem meaningful simply because old maps were already rich with saints, winds, beasts, flags, crosses, and ornamental uncertainty. That does not mean this alleged Templar map is false. It means the burden is heavy. A true pre-Columbian map of Western lands connected to the Templars would need to survive questions that are not romantic at all. It would need to pass through the hands of archivists, material specialists, historians of cartography, and perhaps chemists before its story could safely travel any farther. The parchment or paper would matter. The ink would matter. The handwriting would matter. The language would matter. The way coastlines are imagined would matter. Even the mistakes would matter, because mistakes can reveal the century that produced them. This is where the mystery becomes less like a treasure hunt and more like a courtroom. The map is not allowed to merely look convincing. It has to testify, and a map with uncertain origins speaks in fragments. It says, "Perhaps I am old. Perhaps I was copied. Perhaps I was altered. Perhaps someone misunderstood me. Perhaps I was made to satisfy a market that already loved Templar mysteries. Perhaps I passed through hands that left no trace. Perhaps the most important evidence about me disappeared long before anyone knew to ask." That last possibility is the one believers often hold on to. And to be fair, history does contain broken chains. Archives burn, collections scatter, families sell inherited objects without recording them. Wars carry papers across borders. Private owners hide things, mislabel things, or simply fail to understand what they possess. A missing provenance does not automatically prove fraud, but it prevents certainty. And certainty is exactly what the more dramatic versions of the story require. The temptation is to treat missing records as part of the mystery, as if absence itself were evidence of suppression. But absence is a slippery thing. It can mean concealment. It can mean carelessness. It can mean loss. It can mean the object is not as old as claimed. Most of the time, by itself, it means only that we do not know. That phrase may feel unsatisfying. We do not know. But in a story like this, it is one of the most honest things we can say. Because once the origin of the map becomes uncertain, every later interpretation has to be held at arm's length. The symbols may still be discussed. The possible routes may still be examined. The Templar connection may still be explored as an idea, but the ground beneath the story remains unstable. And perhaps that is why the map continues to attract attention. A well-documented object gives historians something firm to argue over. An undocumented object gives the imagination room to expand. The map's greatest weakness may also be the reason it survives as legend. No final archive closes the case. No clean chain of ownership pins it down. No simple record says, here it is, here it was, here is who made it, here is what it meant. Instead, we are left with a map that seems to have arrived without a proper past. And when an object appears without a past, people rush to give it one. The eye is not a neutral instrument. That is a problem no one likes to admit, especially when looking at a mysterious old map. We want to believe we are simply seeing what is there. A cross is a cross. A line is a route. A cluster of marks is a code. But the human mind does not only observe patterns, it completes them. And once the Knights Templar enter the room, the mind begins working overtime. A simple cross can become the sign of a secret order. A geometric mark can become a cipher. A rough line can become a planned voyage. An unfamiliar name can become a hidden place. Before long, the map is no longer being read. It is being recruited. This is not because people are foolish. It is because symbols are powerful precisely when they are flexible. The Templar image is built from a small set of instantly recognizable signs. The cross, the seal, the military religious identity, the idea of brothers bound by vows and secrecy. Some of these signs are historically grounded. Others have been enlarged by centuries of fiction, treasure lore, political fantasy, and late-night television doing what late-night television does best: taking a reasonable uncertainty and dressing it in a very serious cloak. But on a map, a symbol does not prove its own meaning. A cross may mark a Christian site, a boundary, a warning, a decorative emblem, a copyist's habit, or nothing more than a conventional sign borrowed from another source. Lines may represent currents, routes, borders, imagined geography, artistic structure, or later damage mistaken for intention. Geometric forms may look coded because old maps often compress information into shapes that feel strange to modern viewers. The danger is not the symbol itself. The danger is the leap. To say, this mark resembles something associated with the Templars is one kind of claim. It is cautious. It leaves room for comparison. To say, therefore the Templars made this map, is something else entirely. That second claim crosses a bridge the evidence may not have built. This is where many hidden history stories become unstable. They do not collapse because every detail is false. They collapse because the distance between details is crossed too quickly. A cross becomes Templar. Templar becomes Secret Archive. Secret Archive becomes Atlantic Voyage. Atlantic Voyage becomes knowledge of the New World. Each step may be presented as if it naturally follows the last, but in reality, each one requires its own proof. History does not move by resemblance alone. It moves by connection, and connection is harder. A true connection would require more than visual similarity. It would require context. Was the symbol used by the Templars in this specific form, in this period, in this region, on this type of object? Does it appear alongside other features that support the same interpretation? Is there an independent record linking the map to the order, or to people in its orbit? Can specialists distinguish between a medieval convention and a later imitation? Without those questions, the map becomes a mirror. People find in it the version of the past they already suspect might be hidden there. This is especially true with coded markings. The word code has a strange magic in historical mysteries. It suggests intelligence, danger, and deliberate concealment. A coded map feels more important than a confusing one. Yet the past is full of confusion that was never meant to be secret. Abbreviations, damaged writing, unfamiliar scripts, regional spelling, copying errors, symbolic decoration, and ordinary cartographic shorthand can all look like encryption when removed from their original context. Sometimes the mystery is not that someone hid a message. Sometimes the mystery is that we no longer know how to read an ordinary one. That possibility is less exciting, but often more useful. Because the real work is not to ask whether a symbol feels mysterious. It is to ask whether it behaves like evidence. Does it appear consistently? Does it match known practices? Does it point to a specific historical community or only to a broad atmosphere of medieval Christianity? Can another explanation account for it more simply? This does not drain the map of interest. In a way, it makes the object more interesting. It forces us to look not only at the marks, but at ourselves looking at the marks. Why does one cross seem ordinary on one medieval object, but explosive on another? Why does a line become a route only when a legend needs movement? Why does uncertainty feel like invitation rather than caution? The answer may be that the Templars have become a kind of historical magnet. Their real story already contains enough drama: wealth, faith, warfare, banking, royal debt, trial, destruction. Add a missing map to that story, and the imagination begins arranging the pieces before scholarship has finished checking whether the pieces belong to the same box. This is how a symbol deceives the eye. Not by lying, by allowing too many truths to be projected onto it. A mark can be old and still not be Templar. It can be Christian and still not be secret. It can be strange and still not be evidence of a voyage west. The map's power lies in this ambiguity. It gives just enough shape for belief to grip, and just enough emptiness for the legend to breathe. So when we look at the crosses, the lines, the possible codes, and the odd names, the question is not simply, what do they mean? The better question is quieter. What would they mean if we had never heard of the Templars? That question strips away some of the glamour. It leaves the map colder, flatter, less obedient to the story. And perhaps that is exactly where a serious investigation has to begin. It is tempting to imagine the Templars as if they were designed for a mystery like this. They were wealthy. They moved across borders. They owned property in multiple kingdoms. They operated from castles, commanderies, ports, farms, and financial houses. They were not merely knights in white mantles riding into battle. They were also administrators, landholders, bankers, diplomats of necessity, and men who understood logistics with a seriousness that tends to vanish when later stories turn them into medieval superheroes. That last point matters. The real Templars were impressive enough without adding impossible powers to them. Their world stretched across Europe and the eastern Mediterranean, tied together by ships, letters, payments, supplies, and religious obligation. They had reason to know roads, harbors, political loyalties, safe routes, and dangerous ones. They were part of a wider medieval system of movement, where pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, clerics, and envoys carried news from one end of Christendom to another. So when supporters of the map theory ask whether the Templars could have had access to unusual geographic knowledge, the answer is not absurd on its face. They were connected. They were mobile. They had resources. They existed inside networks where information mattered. But the word could is doing a great deal of work here. Could they have heard strange reports from sailors? Possibly. Could they have handled maps, portolan charts, or navigational information relevant to Mediterranean and coastal movement? That is more plausible. Could later generations exaggerate those ordinary strengths into a secret global intelligence system? Absolutely. In fact, that may be one of the most reliable things in the entire story. The Templars are often misunderstood because their real power was practical, not magical. They knew how to gather money, protect assets, move supplies, manage estates, and support military operations over long distances. That is not as cinematic as a hidden archive containing maps of continents unknown to Europe, but it is historically more interesting. It shows an order embedded in the machinery of its age, and machinery leaves traces. Ledgers, charters, grants, disputes, correspondence, inventories, legal records. The medieval world was not a perfect record-keeping machine, but powerful institutions did not operate entirely in vapor. When they owned land, someone noticed. When they borrowed or lent money, someone complained. When they moved goods, ships and ports and agents were involved. The more elaborate a secret becomes, the more it must explain why none of the ordinary traces survived clearly enough to support it. That is one of the quiet problems with the Templar map legend. It borrows the Order's real reach, then extends it beyond the evidence. A network across Europe becomes a network across the Atlantic. Maritime contacts become oceanic expeditions. Secrecy within a religious military order becomes secrecy on a civilizational scale. The leap is not impossible because imagination cannot picture it. It is impossible to accept without proof because history demands more than a good silhouette. Still, there is a reason the theory clings to them and not to some obscure village monastery or minor noble household. The Templars had the right kind of ambiguity. They were public and secretive at the same time. Public, because they were legally recognized, wealthy, visible, and politically entangled. Secretive, because they were a closed religious order with internal rules, initiation practices, and a life partially hidden from outsiders. That combination made them vulnerable to suspicion even in their own time. After their fall, it made them nearly irresistible to mythmakers. A closed institution with money is always easy to accuse. A destroyed closed institution with money is even easier to romanticize. Once the Templars were gone, their reputation became available. Enemies had already accused them of hidden corruption. Admirers later imagined hidden wisdom. Treasure hunters imagined hidden wealth. Esoteric writers imagined hidden doctrine. Modern audiences imagined hidden maps. Different centuries used the same empty vessel for different desires. That does not mean every Templar mystery is nonsense. It means the name itself has become unstable. Attach Templar to an object, and the object immediately grows a second shadow. A plain chest becomes a treasure chest. A ruin becomes a coded sanctuary. A mark becomes a sign. A map becomes a possible doorway to forbidden geography. The sensible question is not whether the Templars had reasons to hide things. All institutions hide some things: finances, strategies, weaknesses, embarrassments, internal disputes. The better question is whether they had a reason to hide this thing. A map implying Western lands before Columbus would have been more than a private document. If genuine, it would represent knowledge with practical value, navigational, political, perhaps economic. But why conceal it? To protect trade? To preserve a route? To guard a refuge? To keep a strategic advantage? These are the kinds of explanations supporters may offer, and they are not foolish as story logic. As evidence, however, they remain thin, because motives can be invented endlessly after the fact. Give any powerful group a secret map, and we can imagine reasons they might hide it. The harder task is showing that they actually possessed it, used it, protected it, or passed it along. Here again, the map forces us back from romance into method. Means are not proof. Opportunity is not proof. A mysterious reputation is not proof. The Templars may have been capable of preserving valuable information. They may have had access to maritime knowledge beyond what a landlocked noble would know. They may have heard rumors carried by sailors, merchants, or travelers from the edges of the known world. But none of that automatically carries them across the Atlantic. The legend survives because it places a possible object inside a possible network and then lets possibility do the work of evidence. But possibility is only the beginning of an investigation. It is not the conclusion. What we can say with more confidence is this: the Templars were exactly the kind of order whose destruction would create a historical vacuum. Their records were seized, scattered, repurposed, or lost. Their properties were transferred. Their members were imprisoned, absorbed, or forgotten. Their enemies wrote much of the public drama of their end. And after enough time passed, the spaces in the record began to feel intentional. That feeling is powerful. A missing document becomes a hidden document. A lost archive becomes a suppressed archive. A broken trail becomes a secret route. And once that transformation happens, the Templars no longer need to have done anything specific. Their absence begins doing the work for them. So, did they have a reason to hide a map? Perhaps. But the more important truth is that later generations had a reason to believe they did. Because a destroyed order with money, ships, enemies, rituals, and missing records is almost too perfect for the imagination to leave alone. The end of the Templars did not happen like a curtain falling on an empty stage. It happened with doors forced open, men arrested, property seized, records taken, houses searched, names written down by officials who already knew what kind of story they wanted those names to tell. And because the order fell under accusation rather than peaceful decline, its disappearance created the perfect kind of historical wound: sudden, political, and only partly visible. This is where the map legend finds one of its favorite hiding places, not in the centuries when the Templars were openly powerful, but in the narrow space before that power was broken, the moment before the arrests, the moment before royal agents moved, the moment before documents, wealth, relics, correspondence, and private records became dangerous things to possess. In stories like this, the night before destruction always grows larger than the destruction itself. People imagine warnings passed quietly through trusted hands, chests loaded in haste, letters burned, ships prepared, senior brothers giving orders that would never be written down. It is a powerful scene, and it has the advantage of being almost impossible to fully disprove in every detail. But again, the historian has to be the unpopular guest at the feast. A dramatic possibility is not the same as a documented event. What we can say is that the fall of the Templars created confusion. Their assets did not simply vanish into a clean administrative folder. Across different regions, the process of arrest, trial, seizure, transfer, and dissolution unfolded unevenly. Some property was absorbed into other religious orders. Some records survived because officials needed them. Some materials were likely lost, neglected, or destroyed. And in any large institutional collapse, things slip. That much is reasonable. The problem begins when things may have slipped, becomes the most important secrets escaped. This is the gap the legend exploits, because if a map connected to forbidden Atlantic knowledge had existed, the fall of the order gives the story an obvious turning point. Before the arrests, the map could have been hidden. During the chaos, it could have been moved. After the dissolution, it could have passed through unknown hands, protected by allies, heirs, sailors, or former associates who understood its value. It is elegant story architecture, almost too elegant. The danger is that the theory begins with the ending and works backward. It sees a ruined order and asks what might have been removed before the ruin became complete. It sees missing records and imagines deliberate concealment. It sees the violence of political suppression and assumes that whatever is missing must have been powerful enough to threaten someone. Sometimes that logic is justified. Often it is not. History does contain real acts of concealment. Governments hide documents. Religious institutions protect secrets. Families bury scandals. Armies destroy records. Powerful people lie when their survival depends on it. The past is not innocent, and skepticism should never become naivete dressed as discipline. But neither should suspicion become a machine that turns every absence into proof. The Templars were destroyed in a way that invites distrust. Their trials were shaped by politics, money, fear, and the ambitions of rulers. Their reputation was damaged by charges that remain heavily debated, and in many cases, deeply suspect. Because the attack on them was so severe, later generations found it easy to believe that something larger must have been at stake. A secret map fits beautifully into that feeling. It gives the fall a hidden cause. It suggests that beneath the accusations, beneath the debts, beneath the struggle between crown and church, there may have been another layer: geographic knowledge, preserved routes, perhaps a Western refuge or a navigational advantage someone wanted erased. But here, beauty is not our friend. A theory can be beautifully shaped and still be unsupported. The more careful interpretation is quieter. The fall of the Templars created conditions under which records could be lost, moved, misidentified, or absorbed into other collections. It also created a legend-generating machine that has been running for centuries. Every missing object can be imagined as rescued. Every rescued object can be imagined as secret. Every secret can be imagined as dangerous. The map lives inside that machine. Its supposed connection to the Templars depends not only on what it shows, but on what happened to the order that might have held it. Without the fall, the map is merely strange. With the fall, it becomes part of an escape story, and escape stories are among the hardest to kill. They offer the comfort of survival inside catastrophe. They allow us to believe that something valuable slipped through the hands of power, that the archive was not entirely captured, that the last word did not belong to judges, kings, or confiscators. There is a human reason we want that to be true. When an institution is destroyed, especially one surrounded by accusations and political pressure, the imagination begins searching for what survived. Not just objects, but meaning. A hidden map becomes a symbol of resistance against the official ending. It says, "You did not get everything." That may be why the legend persists even when the evidence remains uncertain. The map is not only about navigation, it is about the fantasy of an unfinished fall. A door closing too quickly. A hand reaching through before it shuts. A bundle passed into the dark. A route left behind for someone who would know how to read it. Perhaps something like that happened in some small, ordinary way. Papers moved, valuables hidden, local records concealed, men protected what they could. But whether a map of Western lands was among those things is another matter entirely. For that, the silence after the fall is not enough. It gives the legend atmosphere. It does not give it proof, and so the story moves toward the sea, because every hidden thing eventually needs a path. If the map escaped the collapse of the order, it could not remain an idea floating above history. It would have needed hands, roads, harbors, ships, allies, weather, luck. A secret that survives must travel through the ordinary world. And the ordinary world leaves marks. If a secret survives, it has to become practical. That is the part legends often rush past. They enjoy the hidden chamber, the forbidden document, the last surviving clue. They are less interested in the damp rope, the customs official, the bad weather, the cost of passage, the man at the harbor asking why a nervous stranger is carrying sealed papers onto a ship. But history is made of those obstacles. So if anything connected to the Templars escaped the collapse of the order, it would have had to move through the real geography of medieval Europe. Not through a cloud of mystery. Through roads, ports, rivers, coastlines, warehouses, inns, monasteries, family estates, and merchant networks. Through places where people noticed cargo, counted money, exchanged letters, and asked inconvenient questions. This is where the theory of a surviving map turns toward the sea. Supporters imagine that documents, wealth, or navigational knowledge may have been moved away from centers of danger through maritime routes. The idea is not that a ship simply vanished into legend with a perfect archive in its hold. At least, not in the more careful version. The argument is subtler. If the Templars had allies, contacts, or properties near ports, then valuable material might have passed through those channels after the order came under attack. As a possibility, that is not absurd. As a conclusion, it is far from proven. The Templars did operate in a world where the sea mattered. They needed transport. They needed supply lines. They moved men, money, horses, and materials across long distances. Their eastern commitments made maritime connections valuable. Ports were not decorative edges of their world. They were working arteries. But an artery is not the same as an escape route. A port does not prove a conspiracy. A ship does not prove a secret voyage. A network does not prove that a particular map traveled along it. What it proves, at most, is that movement was possible. And possibility, again, is where this story both breathes and misleads. The route toward the sea is attractive because it gives the mystery motion. A map hidden in a chest is static. A map moving through harbors becomes cinematic. It can pass from knight to sailor, from sailor to merchant, from merchant to some private collection beyond the reach of hostile authorities. It can survive because it keeps moving. It can disappear because the ocean is very good at making records feel small. But the more movement a theory requires, the more evidence it should leave behind. There should be traces of ownership, hints in inventories, mentions in correspondence, odd financial movements, legal disputes over confiscated goods, records of ships, cargo, or persons connected to the right people at the right moment. Not necessarily a single perfect document saying, "Here is the secret Templar map of Western lands," which would be convenient in a way history almost never is. But something. Some pattern that does not depend entirely on later interpretation. Without that, the route remains a line drawn by imagination. Still, it is worth asking why the sea attracts the theory so strongly. Part of the answer is geographical. If the map is alleged to concern Western lands, then the ocean is not just background, it is the central problem. A land route can hide papers. A sea route can explain knowledge. The moment the Atlantic enters the story, every harbor becomes a possible doorway. But another part is psychological. The sea is where certainty weakens. On land, history feels accountable. Roads have towns. Towns have records. Families have names. Boundaries have officials. At sea, the record thins. Ships depart and arrive. But what happened between those two moments often belongs to those who survived the passage and chose to speak. For a legend, that is perfect territory. The ocean can hold rumor without immediately rejecting it. That does not make the rumor true. It makes it harder to exhaust. The Templar map theory depends on this spacious uncertainty. It suggests that after the Order's fall, certain knowledge could have moved through old alliances or maritime contacts into safer hands. Perhaps through sympathetic nobles, perhaps through merchants who cared more about profit than theology, perhaps through former associates of the Order who understood the value of what they carried. Each of those, perhaps, is doing real narrative work. Each one also needs verification, and until that verification appears, the route toward the sea remains a hypothesis built from the known fact that medieval networks existed and the unproven claim that this particular map traveled through them. The distinction matters because real history often begins with networks. Ideas travel through them. Money travels through them. Rumors travel through them. Maps certainly travel through them. But proving that a specific object moved through a specific network at a specific time is much harder than showing that such movement could have happened. This is why the map cannot be allowed to drift too easily. If it is tied to the Templars, where was it before the Order fell? If it escaped, who carried it? If it traveled by sea, from which port? If it passed into private hands, whose hands? If it disappeared for centuries, why does it emerge without a stronger trail? These questions are not designed to kill the mystery. They are designed to keep it honest. A mystery that cannot survive basic questions is not a mystery. It is decoration. Yet there is something compelling in the idea of documents moving quietly through a collapsing world. Not because it proves the map, but because it matches a real pattern of human behavior. When institutions fall, people do not simply stand still and wait to be cataloged. They hide things, sell things, mislabel things, carry things to relatives, entrust things to friends, move things across borders. Sometimes they preserve history for noble reasons. Sometimes they preserve it because no one wants to be caught holding the wrong property at the wrong time. Survival is rarely romantic while it is happening. It is hurried, compromised, and practical. That may be the most useful way to imagine the route toward the sea. Not as a grand secret mission beneath a moonlit sky, but as a series of small decisions made under pressure. A packet handed over. A chest stored in the wrong name. A document folded into a bundle of less interesting papers. A map kept not because it would rewrite the future, but because someone thought it might still be useful. Could such a thing have happened? Yes, in the broadest sense. Can we say that it did with this map in this story? No. And that no is not a failure of imagination. It is the line that separates responsible history from a legend wearing a historian's coat. The sea gives the map a path. It gives the legend movement. It gives believers a way to explain how an object could detach from a condemned order and reappear beyond the reach of its enemies. But a path imagined backward from a mystery is not the same as a route preserved by evidence. For now, the map remains on the shoreline of the story. Behind it, the wreckage of a destroyed order. Ahead of it, the vast Atlantic and the enormous claim that someone knew more about the West than the records admit. And waiting beyond that claim is the figure no version of this mystery can avoid. Columbus. Not because he was first in every sense, but because his voyage became the date against which the map must be judged. Columbus is often placed in history like a dividing line. Before him, darkness. After him, discovery. It is a simple shape, and that is exactly why it became so durable. Simple shapes are easy to teach, easy to remember, and very hard to remove once they settle into the public imagination. But the real history is less obedient. Columbus did not discover a world empty of people. The Americas were already inhabited by complex societies with their own histories, languages, trade routes, cities, sacred geographies, rivalries, and empires. Nor does the broader idea of pre-Columbian contact begin and end with him. Human beings had reached the Americas long before any European kingdom knew how to describe the Atlantic in imperial terms. And even among Europeans, the question of earlier contact is not as blank as the schoolbook version once made it seem. So when an alleged Templar map is placed against Columbus, the issue is not whether Columbus was the first person to reach the Americas. He was not. The sharper issue is whether knowledge of Western lands existed in certain European circles before 1492, and whether that knowledge was preserved in a form that influenced later exploration. That is a much harder claim, and much more dangerous. Because Columbus's voyage became the documented turning point in European contact with the Americas. It was not merely a crossing. It was a crossing followed by records, claims, return voyages, royal backing, colonization, violence, extraction, argument, and administration. In other words, it entered history not as a rumor, but as a machine. Documents multiplied, maps changed, claims were made, Territories were named. Ships went back. Other ships followed. That is why 1492 holds such force. Not because nothing happened before it, but because after it, the contact became politically, economically, and bureaucratically impossible to ignore. A genuine Templar-era map of Western lands would therefore have to do something extraordinary. It would have to show that some piece of Atlantic knowledge existed before that machine began. More than that, it would have to show that the knowledge was specific enough to be meaningful. Not just a vague island, a symbolic edge of the world, or a coincidental shape later readers interpret through modern eyes. This is where the Columbus problem becomes a test of precision. What exactly does the map show? Does it show a recognizable coastline? Does it show islands that can be identified without forcing the comparison? Does it contain names, measurements, routes, or navigational clues that belong clearly before Columbus but point clearly beyond the accepted European horizon? Or does it show ambiguous marks that become America only after we already know America is there? That distinction is everything. Human beings are extremely good at recognizing shapes after being told what to look for. Show someone a blot of ink and suggest it resembles a coastline, and soon the coast appears. Suggest that a group of islands represents the Caribbean, and the eye may begin arranging them into familiar geography. The danger is not deliberate fraud every time. The danger is retrospective certainty. The feeling that something must have been obvious because we are looking backward from the answer. Maps suffer from this more than most artifacts. A rough Western landmass on an old map might represent an actual report. It might represent classical speculation. It might represent a legendary island. It might represent a copying error. It might be decorative balance. It might be later alteration. It might even be a modern fake designed to satisfy precisely this desire for forbidden anticipation. The question is not whether it can be made to fit. The question is whether it fits better than every simpler explanation. Columbus also matters because his story has become strangely double-edged. For centuries, he was treated as the heroic opener of a new world, a phrase already loaded with the blindness of empire. More recently, that heroic image has been challenged, revised, and stripped of much of its old polish. His voyages are now understood not only as feats of navigation, but as beginnings of conquest, dispossession, disease, enslavement, and a catastrophic transformation for indigenous peoples. That reassessment has made space for a more complicated conversation, but it has also created a market for countermyths. Some people are drawn to any claim that weakens the old Columbus story, not because the new claim is well supported, but because the old one was morally and historically incomplete. This is understandable. It is also risky. A bad version of history is not corrected by an unsupported version pointing in the opposite direction. A Templar map, if authentic, would not simply knock Columbus from a pedestal. It would require us to rewrite the story of European knowledge before him. But if the map is not authentic, or if it is being overread, then it does something very different. It shows how dissatisfaction with one myth can make us vulnerable to another. That is why caution matters here. To say Columbus was not first is responsible. To say the Templars knew the way to the New World requires evidence of another order entirely. The first statement fits within a broader and better understanding of human history. The second depends on a specific artifact, a specific chain of transmission and a specific interpretation that must survive serious testing. And at this stage, the alleged map has not earned the right to carry all of that weight without question. Still, the pressure it creates is real. It presses on the soft places in the Columbus narrative, the possibility of earlier rumors, earlier crossings, older maritime knowledge, half-understood islands, sailors' stories that never entered official chronicles, or records that disappeared before they could be attached to known names. The Atlantic before 1492 was not empty of imagination. Medieval maps could contain marvels, inherited geography, religious symbolism, classical fragments, traveler reports, and places no sailor could confidently reach. The edge of the known world was not a clean boundary. It was a fog of learning, speculation, fear, and hope. Into that fog, later readers can project almost anything. That is what makes the alleged map so difficult. If it shows too little, it proves nothing. If it shows too much, it may begin to look suspicious. A map that perfectly anticipates later knowledge can be more troubling than a vague one, because accuracy itself must be explained. How did the maker know? From whom? Through what route? Why does no clearer record accompany it? Why does the knowledge not appear more broadly in the cartographic world of its time? A map that is vague, on the other hand, can survive longer as legend because it never has to stand still. Its features can be interpreted flexibly. Its islands can move. Its lines can suggest without declaring. Its silence becomes useful. So the Columbus problem is not only about dates, it is about standards. What level of evidence would we need before saying that a medieval European order possessed meaningful knowledge of the Western Atlantic? What would separate a genuine pre-Columbian trace from a clever imitation, a misreading, or an accident of resemblance? The answer is not glamorous, but it is necessary. We would need material testing, documented provenance, specialist comparison, linguistic consistency, cartographic context, independent records, a reason the map belongs to its alleged century, not merely an appearance that flatters the legend. Without that, Columbus remains where the documented record places him. Not the first human to reach the Americas, not the first possible European contact in every sense, but the figure whose 1492 voyage became the unmistakable rupture in European history. The alleged Templar map, then, stands in his shadow. Not because it has defeated that timeline, but because it challenges the confidence with which people once told it. And perhaps that is its real power. It reminds us that history is not a polished monument with every date carved beyond dispute. It is an argument built from surviving evidence. Some stones are firm, others are missing. And in the gaps, the imagination moves quickly. Too quickly, sometimes. Because if the map truly predates Columbus and points west, then the question is enormous. Who knew? When did they know? And why did that knowledge remain hidden? But if the map does not, then the question changes. Why do we keep searching the centuries before Columbus for someone else to give the secret to? Now imagine the map removed from legend and placed under cold light. No music, no dramatic pause, no mention of forbidden routes or vanished knights, just the object. This is the moment every seductive historical claim eventually has to face. The story steps aside, and the material begins to speak. Not in the language of mystery, but in the more unforgiving language of fibers, pigments, handwriting, spelling, place names, and mistakes. A map can survive centuries of imagination and still fail beneath a microscope. That is not because scientists are trying to ruin the fun, although from the perspective of a good legend, it must feel that way. It is because old objects carry physical habits. Parchment, paper, ink, and drawing style all belong to particular worlds of production. They do not prove everything by themselves, but they can expose a story that has been dressed in the wrong century. If the alleged Templar map is to be taken seriously, the first question is material. What is it made from? Parchment and paper each have histories. So do inks. So do pigments. The age of the surface matters, but even that can be deceptive. A forger can draw on an old blank sheet. A later owner can add markings to an earlier document. A genuine medieval material can carry a modern lie. This is why dating the support alone is not enough. The marks themselves matter. The ink must be tested. The layers must be studied. The relationship between surface and drawing has to make sense. A map is not only what it shows, it is when its materials learned to exist together. Then comes the style. Medieval maps did not all look alike, and that is important. A religious world map, a practical portolan chart, a regional land survey, and a later Renaissance-style map follow different conventions. They arrange space differently. They value different kinds of information. Some are symbolic and theological. Some are navigational and coastal. Some are decorative displays of knowledge. Others are working tools, scarred by use and correction. So if a map claims to belong to a Templar-era context, it must behave like something from that cartographic environment. Not perfectly. Real objects are messy, but plausibly. The coastline should not know what its century had no way of knowing. The lettering should not slip into a later habit. The ornament should not borrow from a style that had not yet appeared. The scale, compass lines, place names, and visual logic should not feel like someone assembled a medieval costume from several centuries at once. Forgery often fails not through one enormous mistake, but through small anachronisms standing too close together. A letter form too modern, a spelling too late, a coastline too accurate, a name not yet in use, a symbol copied from a famous source that was itself produced much later, a decorative flourish that belongs to another tradition. One wrong detail may not destroy an object, but enough wrong details create a rhythm of suspicion. And maps are especially vulnerable because they preserve the assumptions of their makers. A person drawing the world does not only copy geography, they copy a worldview. They reveal what kind of information mattered to them. They show what they expected a viewer to understand. Even their errors are historically useful. That is why mistakes can be more revealing than accuracy. A genuine old map may misunderstand a region in a way typical of its time. It may repeat a legendary island. It may distort distance according to a known tradition. It may borrow names from earlier authorities. Those errors can actually support authenticity if they fit the period. But a map that mixes medieval decoration with suspiciously modern geographic knowledge asks for trouble. Accuracy is not automatically evidence of truth. Sometimes it is evidence of access. And the question becomes, access to what? A medieval source? A later printed map? A modern atlas? A digital image? The more precise a supposed medieval map becomes about places unknown to its alleged makers, the more it must explain that precision. Language is another cold instrument. Place names carry dates. So do spellings. So do forms of Latin, French, Portuguese, Italian, or other languages that might appear on a map. A name can betray a map by arriving too early. A spelling can reveal that the maker was using a convention from a later period. Even the choice of what to label can expose anachronism. This is where the romance of the map becomes almost painfully fragile. A viewer may be moved by a strange island or a western route. A specialist may be stopped by a word. One word. A single place name that did not exist at the claimed time can do more damage than an entire page of dramatic speculation can repair. The same is true of cartographic technique. Compass roses, rum lines, scale bars, decorative ships, sea monsters, flags, and coastal profiles all belong to evolving traditions. They can be copied, imitated, and revived, but that only makes the problem more complex. A genuine object should fit naturally inside a web of related objects. A suspicious one often feels isolated, old-looking, but lonely. It resembles the past without having relatives there. That loneliness matters. Historians of cartography do not judge a map in isolation. They ask what other maps it resembles. They ask what sources it may have used. They compare coastlines, names, conventions, errors, and omissions. If a map contains a feature, they ask whether that feature appears elsewhere, and when. If it does not appear anywhere else, the feature may be extraordinary, or it may be invented. Extraordinary is allowed, but it has to earn its place. This is where the alleged Templar map would face its hardest examination. Not in front of believers, not in front of skeptics, in front of comparison. Does it belong to a known tradition of medieval mapping? Does it preserve details that make sense before Columbus? Does it contain signs of later handling? Do the pigments sit properly in the surface, or do they reveal different stages of work? Are there erasures, overdrawn lines, repairs, artificial aging, inconsistent wear? Are the most dramatic features also the most suspiciously convenient? That last question is uncomfortable but necessary. When an artifact's most sensational details are also the least securely explained, caution becomes essential. A cross in the corner may not matter much. A line pointing westward does. A name that seems to suggest a New World location matters even more. The more a detail supports the grand claim, the more rigorously that detail must be tested. Legends prefer the opposite. They ask us to treat dramatic details generously because they are exciting. History asks us to treat them more severely for exactly the same reason. And if the map fails these tests, the failure may not be loud. It may not arrive as a confession or a spectacular exposure. It may arrive quietly through a mismatch of ink chemistry, a borrowed coastline, a late spelling, or a material that cannot support the claimed date. The great secret may end not with a revelation, but with an expert saying, almost apologetically, "This does not belong where the story places it." There is something humbling in that. A legend can fill an ocean. A laboratory can puncture it with a fiber. But if the map survives, if the materials fit, if the ink aligns, if the style belongs, if the provenance strengthens, if the strange Western features remain difficult to explain away, then the story changes. Not into certainty, not immediately, but into a serious historical problem. The object would move from curiosity into evidence, and evidence has to be handled with more discipline than wonder. That is the standard. Not whether the map feels ancient, not whether it looks mysterious, not whether it fits what we secretly want to believe. The question is whether it can stand still while every small detail is examined. Because under cold light, the map cannot rely on the Templars' reputation. It cannot borrow drama from Columbus. It cannot hide behind the romance of lost routes or destroyed archives. It has to be itself. Material, marks, language, style, damage, history, and one misplaced detail could collapse the entire legend. A legend rarely begins as a full story. More often, it begins as a detail that refuses to sit quietly. A line, a mark, a name, a shape near the edge of the page, something small enough to be overlooked by one person and enlarged by another. This is how a map becomes more than a map. At first, there may be only a curious feature, a western line that seems too deliberate, a cross placed where someone did not expect one, an island that resembles a place it should not resemble, a route that appears to bend toward the unknown. None of these details by itself has to prove anything. But once a story gathers around them, they begin to behave differently. They start attracting other details. The cross is no longer merely a cross. It becomes Templar. The line is no longer merely a line. It becomes a route. The island is no longer a vague island. It becomes a possible trace of the new world. The absence of records is no longer just absence. It becomes suppression. The destruction of the order is no longer only a political and religious catastrophe. It becomes the perfect explanation for why the map vanished. Notice the movement. The legend does not need to invent everything from nothing. It only needs to connect uncertain things with confidence. That is why stories like this are so difficult to untangle. They are not built entirely from lies. They are often built from fragments that may be real, but have been arranged into a pattern stronger than the evidence allows. The pieces are placed close together until the eye begins to see architecture. And the human mind loves architecture. We prefer a hidden design to a loose pile of accidents. We prefer intention to confusion. We prefer a secret route to a damaged line. It is more satisfying to imagine that someone knew, someone planned, someone concealed, than to accept that history may have left us only a strange object and an incomplete explanation. This is the quiet engine behind many historical legends. A gap appears. A famous name is placed near it. The gap becomes meaningful. With the Templars, the process is especially quick because the order already carries a ready-made atmosphere. You do not have to explain why people might suspect secrecy. The name does half the work before the evidence enters the room. It brings with it money, vows, warfare, trials, lost property, political betrayal, and centuries of speculation. Attach that name to a map, and the viewer's imagination begins filling the margins. The map does not even have to shout. It only has to suggest. Suggestion is often more durable than proof in popular history because proof has limits. Proof says, this far and no farther. Suggestion can keep moving. It can adapt to objections. If one symbol is challenged, another becomes important. If one route seems doubtful, the theory shifts toward a hidden copy. If provenance fails, the missing chain becomes part of the suppression. The story learns to survive by turning weaknesses into features. This does not make every believer dishonest. It reveals something more human than that. People are drawn to stories where history seems unfinished. A mysterious map promises that the past still has sealed compartments. It suggests that the official timeline is not wrong in every detail, but incomplete in the most exciting way. Somewhere, behind the archive there may be another archive, one with the missing names, the missing route, the missing explanation. And perhaps that hunger is not entirely unhealthy. Without curiosity, no one would reopen old questions. No one would examine neglected artifacts. No one would challenge comfortable assumptions. History would become a museum of conclusions, rather than a living argument with evidence. But curiosity needs resistance. Without resistance, it becomes appetite. And appetite will eat anything that resembles a clue. That is why a single mark on a map can grow into treasure theories, secret voyages, hidden archives, suppressed navigation, royal conspiracies, and entire alternate histories. Each edition gives the story more texture, but also more weight. Eventually, the original detail disappears beneath the structure built on top of it. A line becomes a legend because people stop asking what the line can support. They ask what the line could imply. Could it imply knowledge of Western lands? Could it imply a route? Could it imply a surviving Templar network? Could it imply that Columbus inherited something older? Could it imply that the Order's destruction was tied to knowledge more dangerous than debt, politics, or accusation? The word could is the latter. Every rung feels harmless. Every step feels possible. But climb high enough, and the ground becomes very far away. A serious investigation has to climb back down, not to kill the story, but to restore proportion. The line may be interesting. The symbol may deserve comparison. The map may deserve testing. The Templar connection may deserve cautious discussion. But the distance between interesting and historically transformative is enormous. That distance cannot be crossed by mood. It has to be crossed by evidence. The legend grows because mood is easier. It is easier to feel that a map is important than to prove why. It is easier to sense hidden meaning in a strange mark than to place that mark inside the habits of medieval cartography. It is easier to imagine a vanished archive than to reconstruct a chain of ownership. It is easier to say, someone must have known, than to identify who, when, where, and how. This is the point where the map becomes a study not only of medieval history, but of modern desire. We want the past to contain secret knowledge because secret knowledge makes history feel intimate. It suggests that the world was not merely shaped by armies, courts, markets, and accidents, but by hidden hands carrying hidden truths. It gives us the pleasure of standing just outside the official record, listening for a second heartbeat beneath it. The Templars are perfect for that role because their real history ended with enough violence and uncertainty to make speculation feel emotionally justified. Their fall created gaps. Their reputation filled them. The alleged map offers a surface on which those gaps can be drawn. But if we are honest, the most revealing thing may not be the line itself. It may be how quickly we want the line to lead somewhere. A strange feature on an old map should make us curious. It should make us careful. It should send us toward comparison, testing, provenance, and context. Instead, in the hands of legend, it often sends us toward a finished story before the first hard question has been answered. That is the transformation. A mark becomes a clue. A clue becomes a root. A root becomes a secret. A secret becomes a history. And by the time the legend is complete, the original map is almost trapped inside it. This is why skeptics and believers often speak past each other. Believers are responding to the power of the pattern. Skeptics are asking whether the pattern is real. One side sees convergence. The other sees accumulation without support. Both may be looking at the same object, but they are not seeing the same kind of thing. The believer sees a door. The skeptic sees a wall with an interesting scratch. The work is to determine which one it is, and that work is slower than legend wants it to be. Because a legend thrives in the moment before verification. It is strongest when the object is visible enough to excite, but not tested enough to disappoint. Once the map is dated, analyzed, contextualized, and compared, the possibilities narrow. Some dreams may survive, many will not. That narrowing is not a loss. It is how knowledge becomes honest. Still, there is a strange beauty in the way legends grow. They show us which parts of history remain emotionally charged. No one builds elaborate theories around objects they do not care about. The alleged Templar map survives as a story because it touches several deep fascinations at once. Lost knowledge, forbidden geography, ruined orders, oceanic uncertainty, and the suspicion that the past has not been fully confessed. That suspicion may not prove the map, but it explains the map's power. In the end, one line on parchment can become enormous if it crosses the right emptiness. And the Atlantic, before Columbus, is one of the largest emptinesses the modern imagination has ever tried to fill. The divide around the map is not really a divide between people who love mystery and people who hate it. That would be too easy. It is a divide over what kind of evidence deserves trust. On one side are those who look at the alleged map and see a missing piece. To them, the uncertain origin is not fatal. It is part of the reason the object matters. A damaged chain of custody makes sense if the map passed through secrecy, collapse, private hands, or deliberate concealment. Strange symbols do not feel like decoration. They feel like residue. A Western route does not feel like coincidence. It feels like a memory preserved in code. For believers, the map fits too neatly into the larger atmosphere of the Templar story to be ignored. A wealthy order destroyed under pressure. Documents possibly scattered. Maritime networks stretching through a restless medieval world. A reputation for secrecy hardened by accusation and time. Then, somewhere in the aftermath, a map appears to suggest that the Atlantic was not as unknown as the official timeline once implied. From that perspective, skepticism can look almost unimaginative, as if historians are standing before a door and refusing to test the handle because the door is inconvenient. And there is a fair criticism buried in that feeling. Academic caution can sometimes become excessive caution. Institutions do not always welcome objects that threaten established narratives. Scholars can be slow to take fringe claims seriously because so many fringe claims collapse after a little pressure. That habit is understandable, but it can also make outsiders feel that the verdict was written before the evidence was heard. So the believer asks, what if this is one of those rare cases where the uncomfortable object is real? The skeptic answers with a different question. If it is real, why does the evidence arrive so weakly? Why no secure provenance? Why no confirmed material testing? Why no independent chain of documentation? Why do the most dramatic interpretations depend on symbols and lines that can be read in more than one way? Why does the map seem to become more meaningful when placed inside the Templar legend than when examined on its own? These are not attacks on wonder. They are protections against being led by it. The skeptical position is often misunderstood as a refusal to believe anything extraordinary. But good skepticism is not a locked door. It is a demand that extraordinary claims bring enough weight to open it. A genuine medieval map showing meaningful Western knowledge before Columbus would be welcomed by serious historians, not because it would be comfortable, but because it would be important. It would produce papers, arguments, conferences, tests, challenges, and counter-challenges. History has room for disruption. What it does not have room for is disruption by suggestion alone. That is the heart of the disagreement. Believers tend to emphasize convergence. The Templars had reach, the map has strange marks. The order fell suddenly. Records are missing, and Columbus's position in history is already more complicated than the old heroic story allowed. Skeptics emphasize separation. Each of those points may be interesting, but none automatically proves the next. Templar reach does not prove Atlantic knowledge. Strange marks do not prove Templar authorship. Missing records do not prove suppression. A complicated Columbus narrative does not prove a medieval map of Western lands. Both sides are responding to something real. Believers respond to the pattern. Skeptics respond to the gaps inside the pattern. And the map sits between them, absorbing pressure from both directions. The most useful approach is not to mock belief or romanticize doubt. It is to ask what each side is protecting. The believer is protecting possibility. The idea that history may have preserved a clue outside the approved channels. The skeptic is protecting method. The idea that without standards, any object can be made to say almost anything. A good investigation needs both impulses. Possibility opens the case. Method keeps the case from becoming fantasy. The trouble begins when either impulse becomes absolute. Belief without method turns ambiguity into proof. Skepticism without curiosity turns uncertainty into dismissal. The map deserves neither treatment. It deserves the harder middle path. Patient attention without surrender. That means accepting a frustrating truth. The map may be important. It may also be nothing like what the legend says it is. It could be an altered object, a misunderstood object, a later creation, a genuine old map with unrelated symbols, a copy of something else, a decorative or speculative piece whose features were never meant to carry the meaning now placed upon them. Or, less likely but more dramatic, it could preserve a real trace of geographic knowledge that has not yet been properly explained. The difference between these possibilities cannot be decided by tone. A calm skeptic is not automatically correct. A passionate believer is not automatically wrong. The evidence has to do the deciding. That is why the argument should remain centered on the object and not on the personalities around it. Once a mystery becomes a contest between believers and debunkers, the artifact itself often disappears. People begin defending identities instead of testing claims. The map becomes a banner. To accept it is to be open-minded. To reject it is to be rational. Or, from the opposite side, to accept it is to be gullible, and to reject it is to be closed. Those labels are useless. They make the story smaller. The better question is, what would change your mind? For the believer, would a late ink test matter? Would an anachronistic place name matter? Would proof of modern alteration matter? Would the absence of provenance still be acceptable if every material sign pointed to a later date? For the skeptic, would consistent material dating matter? Would a documented chain of ownership matter? Would matching cartographic conventions from the alleged period matter? Would independent records suggesting similar knowledge in a related context matter? A serious position must be able to answer those questions. Otherwise, it is not an investigation, it is loyalty. The map's mystery survives because it has not yet been forced, publicly and conclusively, into one category. Not ancient enough to be securely revolutionary, not dismissed enough to stop attracting attention, not proven enough to rewrite anything, not dead enough to leave the imagination alone. That middle state is fertile. It allows the believer to say, not disproven. It allows the skeptic to say, not proven. And both statements can be true at the same time, but they are not equal in historical weight. Not disproven is a beginning, not a conclusion. Almost anything can live there for a while. A responsible claim has to move beyond survival. It has to earn confidence. It has to become more likely than the alternatives, not merely more exciting. That is where the alleged Templar map still struggles. Its story has atmosphere. It has consequence. It has a famous order, a broken timeline, a vanished trail, and an ocean large enough to hide almost any possibility. What it does not yet have, at least in the cautious version of the case, is the kind of evidence that makes the leap from legend to history unavoidable. And perhaps that is why the debate remains so persistent. The believer looks at the map and sees a buried door. The skeptic looks at the same map and asks who built the frame. Between them lies the real work, not choosing the more satisfying story, but finding out whether the wood is old, whether the hinges belong, and whether the door opens onto anything at all. If the map is not ancient, the story does not end. It changes shape. That is often the part people miss. A forged, altered, or misread artifact is not automatically worthless. It may lose its power as evidence for the medieval past, but it can become evidence for something else. The desires, markets, fears, and fantasies of the age that embraced it. A false map can still tell the truth about the people who wanted it to be real. And with the Templars, that truth is unusually revealing. Few historical orders have been asked to carry so many modern dreams. They have been turned into guardians of treasure, keepers of forbidden doctrine, protectors of bloodlines, architects of secret networks. And now, in this version of the story, possible holders of pre-Columbian Atlantic knowledge. The real order becomes a foundation stone. On top of it, later centuries build whatever chamber they need. A mysterious map fits perfectly into that architecture. It is portable. It is visual. It can be photographed, displayed, sold, debated, enlarged on a screen, and pointed at by someone saying, "Look closely." It does not require the viewer to read a long medieval document or understand a complicated legal dispute. A map gives the illusion of immediate access. You look, and the secret seems almost within reach. That makes it valuable, not only emotionally, commercially. A map linked to the Templars can attract collectors. It can increase the price of an object. It can fuel books, lectures, documentaries, tours, online theories, auction interest, treasure hunts, and entire ecosystems of attention. None of this proves fraud by itself. People can profit from genuine objects, too. Museums sell tickets to see real artifacts every day. And no one accuses the Rosetta Stone of being suspicious because the gift shop has mugs. But profit changes the weather around a claim. It gives people reasons to exaggerate certainty, to smooth over doubts, to avoid inconvenient testing, or to present speculation in the costume of revelation. The more dramatic the object becomes, the more useful it becomes to the marketplace of mystery. That marketplace does not always require a villain. Sometimes no one needs to sit down and invent a fraud from beginning to end. A story can become misleading through smaller acts of enthusiasm. A collector repeats a rumor. A seller highlights the most exciting interpretation. A writer removes a cautious phrase because it slows the sentence. A producer needs a stronger hook. An audience rewards confidence. A symbol that once resembled a Templar sign becomes almost certainly Templar. A possible route becomes the route. A disputed object becomes the map they never wanted you to see. The legend hardens one adjective at a time. This is how modern myths often grow. Not always from a single lie, but from repeated upgrades. Possible becomes probable. Probable becomes proven. Unverified becomes suppressed. And suppressed becomes irresistible. If the alleged map is later than claimed, we would have to ask why it was made, altered, or interpreted in this particular way. Was it created as a deliberate forgery, meant to deceive? Was it a decorative or speculative map later misunderstood? Was it an old object modified by a later hand? Was it a genuine map carrying ordinary Christian or maritime symbols that modern readers pulled into the Templar universe because the connection made the story more exciting? These are very different possibilities. A forgery implies intent. An alteration implies intervention. A misreading implies desire. And desire may be the most important force of all, because the modern obsession with the Templars says as much about us as it does about them. We live in a world overflowing with information, yet we remain fascinated by the idea that the real explanation is hidden, not lost. Hidden. There is a difference. Lost history is tragic. Hidden history is dramatic. It implies agency. Someone kept the truth from us. Someone knew. Someone concealed. Someone benefited from our ignorance. That suspicion is powerful because it offers a strange kind of order. The past becomes less chaotic if secrets explain it. Instead of accidents, we get design. Instead of missing records, we get suppression. Instead of human confusion, we get a hidden chain of control. A secret map becomes a way to believe that the world has deeper structure, even if that structure is dark. The Templars are useful here because their actual history contains enough real injustice and uncertainty to make the suspicion feel morally charged. They were accused, tried, imprisoned, dissolved, and remembered through hostile records as well as later romantic ones. Their fall already feels like a story with missing pages. A questionable map can slide into those missing pages almost too easily. If the map is not ancient, then perhaps the most revealing question is not, who made it? It is, who needed it? not needed in a literal sense, needed as an answer, needed as a key, needed as proof that the ordinary version of history is incomplete in exactly the way they suspected. A collector might need rarity, a seller might need value, a treasure hunter might need a lead, a television producer might need a visual centerpiece, a writer might need a thesis, an audience might need the thrill of standing closer to the hidden truth than everyone else. And sometimes the need is more innocent. People want wonder. They want history to feel alive. They want the past to resist closure. There is nothing shameful about that. The danger begins when wonder is asked to do the work of evidence. A forged map, if that is what it is, would expose that danger very clearly. It would show how quickly an object can become authoritative once it tells a story people are ready to hear. The map would no longer be a relic of medieval Atlantic knowledge. It would be a relic of modern appetite. And that appetite has a history. The Templars have been repeatedly reinvented because they sit at the crossroads of several modern fascinations. Lost wealth, institutional secrecy, religious power, state violence, hidden archives, and the possibility that history's official endings are incomplete. Add the Atlantic and Columbus to that mix, and the story becomes even stronger. Now it is not only about a destroyed order, it is about the map of the world itself. That is why caution is so important. Not because mystery is bad, because mystery is profitable. And when mystery becomes profitable, uncertainty can be packaged as revelation before the harder work has been done. A non-ancient map would not prove that everyone around it acted in bad faith. It would not prove that every Templar theory is foolish. It would not erase the genuine complexity of medieval navigation or the legitimate questions around pre-Columbian contact. But it would remind us that artifacts do not enter the world as pure objects. They pass through hands, institutions, markets, cameras, arguments, and expectations. By the time we see them, they may already be wearing a story. The task is to remove that story carefully enough to see what remains. And if what remains is a later creation, then the map still has a darker lesson to offer. Not about the Templars crossing the Atlantic, but about how easily the past can be reshaped to satisfy the present. That may be less spectacular than a secret medieval route to the New World. But it is no less human. A false map can still be a real warning. It warns us that the desire for hidden history can become so strong that we stop asking whether the secret is there and start asking only how to make the evidence fit around it. History is not rewritten by a shiver. It is not rewritten by a beautiful theory, a dramatic resemblance, or a symbol that seems to glow once the right story is placed behind it. History changes when evidence survives pressure. That may sound severe, but it is the only rule that keeps the past from becoming whatever the present wants it to be. A claim as large as a Templar-linked map pointing toward Western lands before Columbus cannot be carried by atmosphere. It cannot rest on the reputation of the order, the appeal of a hidden route, or the inconvenience of a broken timeline. It has to stand in the plain, difficult company of proof. And proof, in a case like this, would have to arrive from several directions at once. Material dating would matter, not as a decorative stamp of antiquity, but as a serious examination of what the map is made from and when its physical parts came together. The surface would need to belong plausibly to the claimed period. The ink would need to belong there too. If pigments or chemicals point to a later century, the legend begins to narrow. If the drawing rests on old material but the marks are later, the story changes completely. That distinction is crucial. An old surface does not make an old map. A medieval sheet can carry a modern invention, just as an ancient building can hold a new inscription carved by someone who knew exactly how old stone would impress the eye. Then comes provenance. This is the unromantic spine of the whole question. A map that could alter the history of European Atlantic knowledge needs more than a sudden appearance and a persuasive backstory. It needs a trail, a record of ownership, a catalog entry, a reference in correspondence, an archive note, something that anchors it before modern enthusiasm had a chance to shape its meaning. Without that trail, the map remains vulnerable, not automatically false, but vulnerable. A strong provenance does not answer every question, but it prevents the object from floating freely through time. It gives the map resistance. It makes it harder for sellers, believers, skeptics, or storytellers to place it wherever it is most useful. Cartographic comparison would be just as important. The map would need to be studied beside known maps from the period it claims to inhabit. Its coastline style, symbols, lettering, scale, orientation, place names, and errors would have to make sense within a recognizable tradition, or else deviate from that tradition in a way that can be explained. This is where extraordinary objects often face their hardest test. A genuine discovery may be surprising, but it rarely arrives from nowhere. It usually has relatives, not identical relatives, not perfect matches, but contextual neighbors. Other objects that share a visual grammar. Other documents that help explain its assumptions. Other traces that show the idea belong to a real historical environment, and not only to a modern imagination wearing antique clothes. The alleged map would also need linguistic discipline. Names are not innocent. A place name can carry the date of conquest, colonization, translation, religious influence, or later copying. A spelling can betray a century. A language choice can reveal the hand of a region or a period. One misplaced word can make an entire object tremble. That is why a serious authentication would not ask only, "Does this look old?" It would ask, "Does every part of this object behave as though it belongs to the same historical world?" Because forgeries and misreadings often fail at the seams. The parchment says one thing, the ink says another, the drawing style says another, the names say another. The legend asks us to listen only to the most exciting voice. Evidence forces us to hear the whole argument. Independent records would matter most of all. A map that truly preserves pre-Columbian knowledge of Western lands would become stronger if other sources pointed in the same direction. References to unusual voyages, maritime reports, related charts, financial movements, correspondence, or records of geographic knowledge that cannot be explained by later contamination. Not vague hints. Not phrases stretched until they confess. Real supports, coming from outside the map itself. Because a single object can be misread. A network of independent evidence is harder to dismiss. This is how history actually changes. Not by one dramatic artifact bursting into the room and overturning everything in a single gesture, but by evidence accumulating until the old explanation can no longer comfortably hold it. First, an object, then a test, then a comparison, then another record. Then a rival explanation fails, then a cautious claim becomes stronger, then perhaps the timeline shifts. It is slower than legend. It is also more powerful. A rumor can excite an audience for an evening. Evidence can force generations of scholars to redraw the map, and that is the real standard here. Not whether the Templar map would make an extraordinary story. It already does that. The question is whether it can become an extraordinary fact. At present, the responsible position remains restrained. The map, as a claim, may be intriguing. It may deserve examination. It may sit near genuine questions about medieval navigation, lost records, and the oversimplified way Columbus was once presented as a clean beginning. But intrigue is not the same as authentication. The emotional appeal must be separated from the historical case. Emotion says the destroyed order may have carried secrets. Evidence asks which secrets, where, and how we know. Emotion says the map points west. Evidence asks whether the line is original, dated, intentional, and meaningful. Emotion says records are missing because something was hidden. Evidence asks whether the absence can be distinguished from ordinary loss. Emotion says the truth was suppressed. Evidence asks who suppressed it, when, by what mechanism, and why no clearer trace survives. This is not cynicism, it is respect for the past, because the past cannot defend itself against our imagination. The dead cannot correct our documentaries. The mapmaker, whoever that person was, cannot lean over the table and say, "You have misunderstood me." The only protection they have is method. And method is not the enemy of mystery. It is the thing that tells us when a mystery is real. If the map were ever to pass the necessary tests, if its material, ink, style, language, provenance, and comparative context aligned, then the cautious tone would have to change. Not into wild certainty, but into serious attention. The question would move from, "Is this legend plausible?" to what historical process could have produced this object. That would be a different investigation, a better one, because then the map would no longer be surviving on the glamour of the Templars. It would be surviving on its own strength. Until then, the legend must remain exactly where the evidence leaves it. Unresolved, suggestive, unstable, and fascinating for reasons that may have as much to do with us as with the Middle Ages. History can be rewritten. It has been rewritten many times, but not by wanting the hidden version to be true. Only by finding something strong enough to make the old version incomplete. In the end, the map remains where it has been all along, half in the archive, half in the imagination. That is an uncomfortable place for an object to live, if it is authentic, if its materials and markings truly belong to the medieval world, if its symbols and roots are original, if its Western hints cannot be explained by coincidence, later copying, or modern invention, then it may represent something extraordinary. Not a complete answer, not proof of every Templar legend ever attached to it, but a trace, a hard, physical trace, that some piece of geographic knowledge moved through Europe earlier than the familiar story allows. That would matter. It would not make the Templars masters of the Atlantic overnight. It would not prove secret colonies, hidden fleets, or a grand conspiracy beneath the age of exploration. Responsible history does not leap from one artifact to an empire of assumptions, but it would open a door. It would force new questions about sailors, reports, lost routes, borrowed knowledge, and the quiet movement of information before official voyages turned the Atlantic into a stage for conquest. If the map is not authentic, the story still does not vanish. It becomes a different kind of evidence. Evidence of how badly we want history to contain locked rooms. A forged map, an altered map, or a misunderstood map would tell us less about medieval navigation and more about modern longing. It would show how the Templars, centuries after their destruction, remain useful to the imagination. Their name still has the power to make a mark feel coded, a route feel forbidden, an absence feel deliberate. That may be the darker secret beneath the entire mystery. Not that a hidden order necessarily knew the way across the Atlantic, but that we are so ready to believe someone did. We are drawn to the idea that history has a second layer, a concealed draft, a version withheld from classrooms, archives, and official timelines. Sometimes that instinct is valuable. It pushes us to question inherited stories, to return to neglected evidence, to remember that the past was never as simple as the monuments built from it. But the same instinct can mislead us. It can make uncertainty feel like proof. It can turn missing records into suppression, resemblance into connection, and possibility into fact. The alleged Templar map survives because it stands at the meeting point of those two impulses, the need to question and the need to believe. One is the beginning of investigation. The other, if left unchecked, can become a trap. So perhaps the honest conclusion is not dramatic. The map has not rewritten history. Not yet. It has not defeated Columbus's place in the documented record. It has not proven a Templar voyage west. It has not given us a clean chain from medieval Europe to the New World. The evidence, as it stands, is too uncertain for that. But it has revealed something worth keeping. It has shown how fragile historical confidence can become when an object appears in the wrong century. It has shown how much power a single line can gather when drawn across an ocean of missing evidence. And it has reminded us that the past is not only made of what happened, it is also made of what survived, what disappeared, and what later generations could not stop imagining. Maybe one day, the map will be tested beyond dispute. Maybe the ink will betray it. Maybe the parchment will protect it. Maybe a forgotten inventory, a private letter, or a related chart will surface and give the object a past strong enough to stand on. Or maybe it will remain exactly as it is now, a shape in the dark, too compelling to ignore, too uncertain to trust. There is a strange dignity in leaving it there. Not every mystery deserves to be solved by force. Some deserve to be held carefully, with the evidence in one hand and the desire for wonder in the other. The danger comes when we close one hand and pretend it contains both. The Templar map, whether relic or illusion, asks us to look at history with a colder kind of curiosity, to ask not only, what secret is being hidden, but also, why do I want there to be one? That question may not lead to buried treasure, lost harbors, or forbidden routes across the Atlantic, but it leads somewhere more honest. Because sometimes the most powerful secret is not what history hides from us. It is how badly we want history to be hiding something.